Mr. President, BGS members, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the Kettle's family farm in Lisnaskea, County Fermanagh, Northern Ireland. Today on the virtual tour you will see the management of a suckler cow enterprise and a dairy bred beef finishing enterprise. Both systems are seeking to make maximum use of quality grass to control costs and deliver a return for the input from the family.
My name is Robert Kettyle. You're very welcome to our farm as part of the British Grazing Society virtual farm tour this year. And our farm is in County Fermanagh, not far from Lisnaskea and Lough Erne. You're very welcome along, and I'll try and show you around the farm. My father moved here in 1959. He bought this farm. There were 200 acres, but about 20 years ago another 37 acres came up for sale beside us, so we were able to buy that. We now have 237 acres at home here and roughly 106 acres on the island. In total we have about 340 acres. It's predominantly a beef farm, and in recent years we've changed slightly. We had suckler cows, roughly about 120 suckler cows, and we've decided to reduce the number of cows and introduce the blade scheme to our farm here, which is really buying in 12-week-old dairy bred calves and rearing those through to beef. We're actually in an area with drumlin hills. On this farm we have four hills, and they are quite dry. The land is quite good there. It's actually be sort of heavy clay land. The flat land would be more peaty ground, but in good years, dry years, we produce a lot of grass here. But in wetter years now we just maybe struggle a bit with the weather. But the rainfall in this area is quite high, at roughly about 40 inches per year. We obviously can grow a lot of grass because of the rainfall, and we try to produce as many kilos of beef off the grass as we can. We had 120 cows, we've reduced those to about 90 cows, and I bought 80 dairy bred calves in the last 12 months, and the plan is to finish those and maybe even go more down that road as well, reduce the cows further. But it's more to do with management of the farm. We have high rainfall in this area, and the soils are quite heavy too, so we have to try and manage our land as best we can. And I felt that the suckler cows were just getting too heavy for the land, especially when we get wet summers, which is getting more common now too. So with the calves you have lighter stock on the land, and it just seems to be a good system. Maybe not everybody's cup of tea, but certainly something that I've enjoyed. And I suppose in the past maybe I thought that dairy bred cattle would have been a threat to our business, but now I see it more as an opportunity. When I came home to farm, my father had been running a beef finishing enterprise here. He would have bought store cattle, mostly in the west of Ireland, but I started up the suckler herd in the early 1990s, and we are using mostly Simmental bulls now to produce a Simmental cow. We did use Limousin cows in the past, but we find the Simmental cow as a good cow that lasts, milky cow, and produces a good square calf, which is what we need. We're using Angus bulls mostly at the moment. In the past it was Charolais bulls, but the Angus fits in with what I am doing here. I want something that's easy calved, and the calves are obviously lively when they're born too, will suckle very quickly, and it's an easy system to manage. And especially now with the bonuses which are paid on Aberdeen Angus beef, it's it's worked well. And in the past I suppose we were using Charolais bulls, and we did finish mostly as bull beef, but that's a high cost system, and I find that the steer system using Angus bulls is probably the most profitable and suitable for our land here in Fermanagh. Generally speaking, we try and have store cattle out to grass at the end of March, but this year has been very cold and we've had to keep them in. I think it was the first week in April or second week in April when most of the store cattle were out. We like a good long grazing season. If we can keep the cattle out of grass for 7 months, it's great. The aim would be to put on maybe 200 kilos of live weight on the grass during the summertime, which is possible, but it's very much dependent on keeping the cattle out. We've obviously had bad summers here too, where maybe cattle have had to be rehoused, and that may change the situation a wee bit, but generally speaking, that's one of the targets you try to aim for, is 200 kilos of live weight gain from the grass. So far I found the blade system to be working well for me. We bought the first batch of calves April last year, and they've been on the farm now for 12 months or over 12 months, and I think over the 12 months they probably average 0.85 kilos a day live weight gain, which is good for dairy cross calves, and that's on a low input system as well. I think they probably only ever got maybe 1 kilo of meal. Springtime would be the main calving time for us. We try and spread the calving a wee bit from February right through to May. It just helps with the bull situation. We're not, we make more use of the bulls we have, and maybe cuts down the workload as well. We're not just calving all in 5 or 6 weeks. And then we have a group of calves that calve in the autumn time, about September, October. The labour end of things, there's myself and our full-time workman, and we try to keep the labour down as much as we can. We bring in some help to do the slurry and silage as well, but it's mostly just ourselves that do the work on the farm. And I suppose the calving is myself. I'm here tonight on my own, and that's why the Aberdeen Angus suits our system. We've had a camera for the calving pens for the last 20 years, and we find it does the job. We've a fantastic system where the cows are in the yard just behind the pens, and we just move them into the pens when they're about to calve, and we probably keep them there for maybe 1 or 2 days and then move them on to other pens. We've actually about 15 loose pens on the farm, so it gives us a good chance to get the calves up and going for a week or so before we mix them with other cows and calves in bigger groups. Well, most of our Simmental cows would be U&R grading cows. We find that she passes that on to the calves. The calves are good square calves, and the Aberdeen Angus in the factory gets good bonuses, but it's usually U&R grades that we get, so we've nothing to worry about with grading. And target weight roughly between 300 and 380 kilos. We've had quite a few in around the 380 kilos, but it very much depends on the bulls we're using. We have a variety of bulls. The bull I'm using at the moment, he's probably better growth figures, and the previous bulls I've had have been maybe Canadian bulls. The conformation might be just as good. I think it very much depends on the figures that the bull has, and if you get the U&R grades, you're obviously going to get the top price. I think milk's probably the most important thing in any suckler cow. If you haven't got milk, you'll have no calf. I think the calf depends very much on the mother's milk, especially in those first 3 or 4 months. And I would steer away from these extreme cows, because I don't think they'll last, and I don't think they have enough milk. So the Simmental for me is probably the one that fits my system best with the milk, and especially when I put the cows to the island. It's a bit rougher grazing there, maybe the grass just not as good, and there's still plenty of milk for the calves when the calves come off the island at the end of October, looking good. Temperament is very important as well. I think we've used Simmental bulls that have had a very good temperament, and I think that's been passed on now to the cows, and I think that's very important, especially when you're on your own with a cow calf maybe at night and no help around. It's certainly one of the things you look out for in a cow is good temperament. Good silage is probably the most key thing on any farm. Especially a farm like ours, you're producing beef in the winter time. The aim would be to produce silage with a D value of in around 70. That allows us to cut back on our concentrate feeding in the winter time, and obviously that's one of the costs you can save. With good silage, we are able to cut back on our concentrate feeding during the winter months, which is very important, especially in a system where you have low margins to start with. And our policy is to go out in the springtime with the slurry as early as we can, usually in February or early March latest, with 2,000 gallons or 2,500 gallons per acre, and then we use a 2706 fertiliser with sulphur. The sulphur is probably very important in this county, especially with heavier soils. And then the second cut, we try to go out again with more slurry and the same fertiliser, and if it's possible to try and make a third cut in September, early September if it's possible. But we like to try and get 3 good cuts of silage in around sort of 2,000 or maybe 2,300 tonnes of silage to see us through the winter months. We try and soil sample every field at least once in 3 years. This is a very useful tool for any farmer. You can balance your slurry with the fertiliser that's needed. You're not over sowing with peas or Ks. Most of our ground, when tested, is come back at 1 to 3 index for P, which is probably average for this, normal for this county. The fertiliser is mostly 0p fertiliser to balance that. Most of our work on the farm, silage making, is done with the contractor. We used to cut our own silage, but in the last 10 to 12 years it's been all done with the contractor. And the slurry now as well with the umbilical system. We do have our own slurry tanker which we maybe use from time to time, but most of the slurry is spread with a contractor with an umbilical system. The aim would be to make our first cut of silage at the end of May, and we try and get it in one day and get it covered the next day, just to try and reduce spoilage. We've used the cling seal film on the silo pit in recent years, which we find very useful because it definitely eliminates any wastage under the black polythene cover, and then we use the green covers as well to try and keep it weighed down. One thing we find in this area with heavy soils is compaction. The heavy machinery and then the weight of the cows as well in the summertime, especially if we have a wet season, they do a lot of, compact the ground and do a lot of damage. I've been using a subsoiler in recent years, which I find very good, and probably would try and do most ground every 3 or 4 years, but that is very much weather dependent. I have found in recent years, if we can reduce the silage with a D value in around 70, I can cut back the meal feeding to the finishing cattle to roughly about 5 kilos a meal. Previously we might have been finishing cattle on 7 kilos, but I think if you've good silage, that's one of the things you can do is cut back your cost with the meal, and at the end of the day that's what it's all about. The way the blade system works is you buy your calf, it comes from a rearing unit at 12 weeks old, and then it's up to yourself how you feed that animal, how you can cut your costs. If you produce good silage, you'll be able to reduce your meal feeding, which is probably the best way of eliminating costs. And then at the end of the day, you've got a fixed price as well. So it's up to yourself how much that margin is in the middle at the end. The first group of calves I had, they were fed on literally half a kilo of meal last summer and good grass, and they're putting on 0.85 kilos a day. Once I went into the shed at the end of October, we were feeding them 1 kilo of meal with good silage, 70 D value silage, and then that was probably until early February, end of January. We cut the meal feeding back to I think 0. They were just getting good quality silage. They've gone out to the grass now and they're performing very well. They've obviously made use of the compensatory growth, and they seem to be moving on. I'd imagine they're probably doing 1.1 kilos a day at the moment. One thing I found with feeding good silage to beef cattle, you can reduce the meal feeding over the winter period, and we have found this past winter with feeding Angus cattle that with good silage we were able to get away with little or no feeding. From Christmas, this group of cattle were only getting 1 kilo of meal through to maybe January, February time, and then no meal since. We'd planned to put this group of cattle to the grass for summer grazing, but they just seemed too close to the market to put to the grass. So we've been maybe feeding a wee bit of meal for the last few weeks, but the plan would be to finish them during May and June when the price would be good. Yeah, Dernish Island, it's on Lough Erne. My grandfather bought part of the island back in 1911. At that time there were 4 landowners on the island and I think 6 families living on the island. My father then, obviously he farmed the island then right through until the 70s, and in 1972 another part of the island came up for sale, so he was able to buy that, and then the remainder of the island he was able to buy in 1980. So we actually own the complete island. There's over 100 acres, about 106 acres of grassland, and it's probably one of the most important sites in Northern Ireland as regards breeding waders. And we have been able to manage the breeding waders on the island over the years through some of the schemes which have been there. At the moment we're in the environmental farming scheme. In the past we've been involved with the management of sensitive sites, which was a scheme back in the 90s. But as regards the island, we try to keep suckler cows on the island. Cows and calves is probably the best system for the island. In the past my father had store cattle on the island, but I find that if we can put cows and calves on early April or maybe mid-April and leave them right through until the end of October, it's a very easy system to manage. The cattle stay there all summer, and the calves do very well. The cows, But it's obviously an area which gets very little fertiliser because of the sensitivity of the site. So the cows work well, they produce good milk for the calves, and the calves do well for us. The island is divided up into about 4 divisions. One part of the island, there's 50 acres, and we divide that up into 2 with electric fence, and then the cattle will graze that rotationally during the summer, and then the other section is divided up into smaller fields, and it works well. The island farm is about 3 miles from our home farm here, and when we're moving the cattle, we use a lorry to transport the cattle down to the shore, and then they're put onto a barge, which in Fermanagh we call a cot. It's the local name for it, and the island is about roughly 200 to 300 metres from the mainland, and we usually spend one day putting the cattle on and then another day taking them off. But the system works well for us. We put the cows and calves on early spring, and they stay there right through until the end of October, when the grass starts to fail and the weather obviously changes as well. But we find the cattle do well there. I usually try and go to the island every second day, if not every day. Depends very much on the weather. If it's windy or wet, you may just put it off until the next day, but I would like to see the cattle at least every second day. The cattle are usually safe there. I mean, once we put them on, we have them covered for worms and things like that, but generally don't have to handle them very often. Dernish Island was designated the SSI in 1991, and the main reason was because of the population of breeding waders on the island. At that time, there was quite a big population of curlews, redshank and snipe. The schemes at the time were there to encourage us to farm it sensitively. We were obviously told when we could sow the fertiliser, when we could top the grazing, but it has all worked in well with our system. The present scheme, the environmental farming scheme, it has replaced the old moss scheme, which was there back during the 90s, and this gives us some money which compensates for the lack of grazing potential which we have, although at the same time we can still put 95 cattle on the island for the summer. The bird population, the breeding waders were important at the time, and we manage it to accommodate the birds alongside the animals. We don't like to see the birds' nest trampled, and because of this, we are told when we can put the cattle on. Some of the land can't be grazed before the 1st of May, but other areas can be grazed before that, so we just have to move the animals around to suit that. If we have a sick animal, there's a good crush and a yard for gathering up the animals. This is also important too if we have a TB test. We've had to do TB tests on the island during the summer, and it's probably one of the most important things on the island. I know very few people would have an island as part of their farm, but one thing that I have found over the years, it's very relaxing in the summertime, especially when the weather's good. You can go in there, you have the livestock, you have the birds, you have a lot of other wildlife as well, and it's almost like going on a holiday. We have also a flying herd of deer. Probably would have originated in the Crum Estate, which is quite close by, but at the moment there's probably about 20 deer which are there permanently on the island. One thing about the deer is they're very good swimmers. One minute you could be looking at the deer beside, the next minute they could be swimming off to the next island or onto the mainland. Another feature on the farm is a disused railway line. The railway ran through the farm until 1958, just the year before my father moved to the farm. When he came here, the tracks were still on the line, and he got the opportunity then to buy the portion of land. I think he bought roughly 4 acres of railway line for £100. So it has been great for us because it's a good farm lane. Obviously helps with management of stock, and in the past we've been able to obviously concrete it as well, so it's been a great asset to our farm. Work-life balance is very important for any farmer, and I suppose going forward my plan would be to maybe reduce the suckler cows a bit more, increase the dairy bred cattle, and try and have things a bit more manageable, especially now as you get a bit older and maybe help's not as good on the farm. I did depend a lot on my father in the past, but he is obviously retired now, so there's just really myself. and the workman. But I enjoy holidays. We like to ski in the wintertime, and I think it's important, especially when you have a family, that you're able to enjoy life with them. And I was involved in a pilot scheme about 20 years ago for EID, and just looking into the advantages of EID on farms. I know the project only lasted 3 years, but during that time I realised the importance and the use that we could get from having the animals tagged with electronic tags, and I'd imagine it's probably something that will come back in the future again. So this year we started to tag our calves again with electronic tags, and that's the plan, to try and have all the animals tagged again with electronic tags. And as we find weighing cattle very useful, linking up the electronic tag with the weigh head on the weigh bridge is very useful. You obviously can capture your data and your weights, whatever, and download that with little ease into your computer, and you get a lot of information that way as regards live weight gains and performance. And I think this is probably one of the things we need to do most, is to review our targets. We have targets of weight gains, and this is probably something we need to do more often, just to make sure that the animals on the farm are performing and we're getting best value from our inputs. Well, I believe with what's coming down the line as regards carbon and all the other things, grass-based systems are probably the system which will last and will be very important in the future. So I think in Fermanagh, with the growing season we have here for grass, we're probably way ahead of the game as regards growing grass, and I think suckler cows maybe are not getting a good name at the moment as regards carbon they produce. So maybe the dairy bred beef is something that we will see more of in the future, especially with the increase in the number of dairy cows coming through the system. So this is probably a direction which I see myself travelling in the future. Thank you all for joining us today on this virtual tour of our farm. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's certainly something that I am very passionate about, is producing quality beef, and living in a farm, on a farm in a good grass growing area. It's certainly something which we will make more use of in the future.